Hi guys, this is Bert Kammerer, and today we're going to be building the Goblin Fireball. Going to be doing a complete build from beginning to end. I'm going to try to fast forward some of the sections that take too long to show, like when I'm screwing things up, not screwing things in the literal sense, but you know, when I'm screwing bolts and nuts and things like that. We're just going to fast forward through those sections, but nonetheless I'll show you the entire build and some tips and tricks along the way, so it should be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and change to our overhead camera, and I'm going to start the build, showing you what I get, how I get prepared to do my builds, and what I get, how I lay out my workbench and tools and everything else. Here we go. Okay, so here we go. So the first thing I do is I make sure I have all my tools. I have probably tools that I really honestly don't need. And I have tools, and I'm also missing some tools, but I make up for it with some pliers and things like that. The manual recommends a certain amount of tools and different kinds of tools. You really don't need them all. It's better if you have them all. For example, socket wrenches is better for your nuts to use socket wrenches than it is to use like pliers. But if you don't have them, pliers will do. I used to have a great collection of tools, and over the years traveling and things like that, a lot of the stuff has gotten lost. But anyway, you know, good old needle nose pliers, they help a lot. And I don't think I'll need these. Actually, I've already built the Fireball, and I didn't need the bow link pliers because the bow links are so small you can use your hands. You really don't want to booger them up with that. But you know, you need 1.5s and you need a number 2. I have 2 of each. This is a number, actually I have a single one, number 2. I have 2 2.5s. Phillips screwdriver, flat screwdriver, I don't think I'll need those. I always keep a Sharpie in case I need to mark something or do something like that. Some scissors and some cutters for zip ties and things like that. And I have blue Loctite and red Loctite. The manual makes reference to green Loctite and makes reference to blue Loctite. Generally, I particularly don't like to use green simply because it's very, very difficult to remove a bolt once it's been green Loctited. So I generally use red instead of green. It seems to hold a little better than blue, but yet you can remove it. So once you get your tools, generally what I do is I just get all my tools laid out. I'm going to get them out of the camera area here. But I get all my tools laid out. I make sure I have everything I need, because there's nothing that really sucks the most than being in the middle of a build and realizing, oh, I forgot this, and then you have to go and find stuff in your garage or whatever to continue your build. You really don't want to go through that. So get all your tools laid out, get everything ready. And then obviously, excuse me, have your manual handy. You're definitely going to need to use this and go through every step. And I'm going to do this build as per the manual. And as you can see here in the manual, it talks about, you know, your typical warnings and things like that, your specs for the helicopter, your various different views of the machine, and then it talks about what tools do you need, what components do you need. We're building the combo version, so I'm not going to go into flight control setup. I'm not going to install a flight controller. Everybody has a different flight controller, different flight control preferences. I've flown this model with a Spartan model, and I've flown it with a Neo. It flies awesome with both of those flybarless systems. Again, we're not going to go that far. We're just going to pretty much build a helicopter to the point where it needs flight controller, and then we'll stop. But, excuse me, it tells you what tools you need and things like that. You know, it says here that you need some socket wrenches. We'll make without, but if you have the socket wrenches, that'll be better. So, get your manual handy. And then one thing I talked about when we cover the I was talking about unboxing the machine. I was talking about the registration. Don't forget to register. This is very important. The guys at SAB always struggle to get people to register. And then if somebody ever has a problem, there's no record of that particular customer ever having purchased the helicopter or who he purchased it from. Just take a second. It really only takes a minute or two to go to the Goblin helicopter, goblin-helicopter.com, and register your machine with your serial number. So, I do have every single bag already open and all in perfect order. And as you open the manual and you start your build, you're going to see that you have bags 1 through, I believe, 16. So I'm not going to lay them all in here, but make sure that you have all your bags already laid out. I have them laid out in perfect order, so I don't have to be looking for stuff as I do my build. When I start building, I just like to build. I don't like to stop and look for things and figure out why I'm missing something or whatever. I just want it all laid out on the table, make sure I have it all, because once I begin, I want to be able to end. So that's it for my preparation. So let's move on to the first part of the build, which is, according to the manual, is going to be the tail servo assembly. So we're going to need bag 1. So we're going to reach into bag 1. And one thing that I like to do is I like to keep a little, I guess you could say it could be an ashtray, it could be a little tin can, it could be something to where you can throw your screws in as you build and not have to worry about losing things as you're doing your build. So let's move on. Let's start with this thing right here, which is tail servo assembly. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with this, again, with the section here, mainframe, bag number 1, which I have ready here. This is the back of one of my BK servo little cases, and it's just pretty practical so you don't lose your stuff. So basically, every time I do a build, I just get organized. I make sure I empty all the bag contents, set my trash bags on the side here. And I've located bag 1, I've located the tail servo, and I know it's the tail servo because it's got the T at the end. The Cyclic ones are C, model C, 12C or 12T. This is the tail. And normally what I just did off camera, and I recommend everybody does, is I plug this into a servo tester. A lot of chargers, LiPo chargers have testers built in, and I just centered it. And this is a 760 pulse frequency. So make sure that if you do that, you set it to the right frequency. You have no idea how many people we get coming back to us with a burnt tail servo, saying, oh, it didn't work, and they had it plugged in at the wrong frequency. This is 760 on the pulse. And you don't have to do this ahead of time, but it makes your life much easier. If you do have a servo tester or a LiPo charger that can test servos and center servos, go ahead and center all your servos. I do that every time. That way, when I make, my setup and I have my servos installed, they're already centered. You can also plug it into a flight controller or a receiver and make sure they're centered. That way, you can install your servo horn in the correct direction. I did not put the servo, the ball link in the horn yet, but I did center it, and I installed the servo horn in it and Loctited it in, and it's good to go. I also got the frames, which we're going to need for this step. Frames were bolted together with 2 bolts, these 2 bolts right here, so I removed them because they need to be reinserted with Loctite. So we're going to move on here, and then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put that servo ball link shown here in the manual and the servo. So if I'm not mistaken, these are tiny little ball links. These require a 1.5, and there it goes. And if you look at the manual, it shows that it should be on top of the horn, and it shows that it should be on the second hole. And normally, for all of you guys familiar with SAB models, when you put a servo ball link on a servo horn, you have to put a nut on the other side. But this is such a little machine that it really doesn't need it. Some people like to put a little drop of CA right there. I'm not going to. I don't think it's necessary. This thing is, again, is so tiny that it just doesn't need that. Alright, so now that I got that ready and I got my frame separated, then I'm going to follow the instructions here as per the manual. So, the servo should go, if you look at the frames are right side up like this. The servo has to go with the horn facing forward. In other words, the spline on to the forward of the frame, and this position, and it locks in place. Let's get that done real quick. So there's, if you pay attention, there's a couple of little like grooves right here. Slots, I guess you could call them. And make sure your wire is out of the way. And this should actually fall in place nice and neat. If I had better light here, I'm trying to get the best light I can get for the video, which is not the best light I can get for my eyes necessarily. Just like that. And then once we're done with that, what we're going to do is we're going to take these two bolts. I've got to be careful not to take it apart again. Two bolts that were already installed, and I'm going to put them back in. These required a 2 millimeter hex, and I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite. And if I'm not mistaken, these go in through here, through the left side of the frame. So we'll do the 2 real quick. Done. Okay, up next we're going to go ahead and take, as you can see in the manual, we're going to do these other 2 bolts right here. These are 2.5 by 8s. And 2.5 by 8s should be right here. And according to this, we need, make sure I have the right length, 2.5 by 8. Yep. Should be 4 of those. 2.5 by 8. So we're going to go ahead and do those in the back of the frame. One is going to go right here. And I'm not going to tighten these because we're going to need to leave them a little loose to be able to insert the boom at a later step. But I'm going to put Loctite, and I'm going to leave them a little bit on the loose side. And in the meantime, my servo's moved out of position. There we go. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and take this 2 by 10 bolt, which you use a 1.5 for, and we're going to put it in the front right here. And this is not, most of the bolts in this frame are going through a pin nut on the other side that's holding the bolt together. This particular one is just screwing into plastic, which is not a big deal because it's just a little bit extra support right here. So it's really not, doesn't need to be, don't over tighten it so you don't strip the plastic, just snug it very lightly. Done. And then the next and last step for this section is the landing gear. So we're going to locate our landing gear and make sure you have it in the right direction, of course. So this is the forward of the machine is in this direction. Put it like that, and then we're going to locate these tiny little nuts, and we need 4 screws, or 4 bolts, I guess technically they are bolts, and they're 2 by 8s. And we have these 4 little washers that are practically impossible to grab. And so we're just going to put the bolts through these washers, and then we're going to put them all 4 in here. Okay, so now we just make sure they're nice and tight. Again, don't over tighten these, although these are going into a real pin nut. So in other words, they're not being screwed onto plastic. You still don't want to over tighten any of these bolts because it's very easy to strip stuff on such a small machine, such small hardware. Okay. So I ended up with 2 extra bolts here, and I'm assuming that it's a genuine mistake from SAB because when I took the frame out of the box, the frame already had these 2 bolts, and they're identical to this 2 extra bolts that I ended up with. So I'm just going to set them aside, and just in case I need them later. Normally I don't get worried when I have extra stuff. Sometimes SAB throws extra stuff in the kit. I'm more worried obviously when I'm missing stuff. So alright, so that's the first step. We've completed chapter 4 mainframe. Now we're going to move on to chapter 5. Okay, let's start with the chapter 5, which is the tail system. So back to, I already opened. I have my bigger parts here. One note, one thing that I wanted to talk about was normally I like to use a white towel. Unfortunately, I have a black towel, so I apologize in advance if this makes it a bit of a challenge to be easily seen on video. Again, I apologize, but I got the big parts here on the towel on the table, and then I have all the little parts again in my tray. And then I'm just going to start with tail rotor assembly here and assess to stick this little shaft. Make sure that you have the end with the dimple there going inside this tail hub, and these are tiny little parts, as you can see. It's really hard to work with them, especially if you have big fingers. But make sure that dimple is lined up perfectly there with the slot where you're gonna insert the set screw. So you take that set screw, which is I believe a 3x4, and it requires a 1.5, and put a little bit of Loctite, and we're just gonna put it in there. And again, don't over tighten these parts, just kind of get a good feel for it, but don't overdo it. Seems like it's perfect. And then it shows you here in the manual that you have a tail slider, pitch slider. It's already assembled, so it's good to go. Now this part is a particular pain because I've done this before, and the reason why this part is a pain is because the parts are really small. As you can see, we have thrust bearings, which for a helicopter this size is like crazy, but we have thrust bearings for the tail, and I didn't take them out of the bag so I don't get them confused. So the key here is you want to use a little bit of grease on this. You don't need much because they're so small, so freaking small that you don't need much. But any kind of grease, synthetic grease, I use some Protec stuff. They use this on cars. Anything really works. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on this, and generally when I do that, it makes a mess. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and determine, I'm going to see which bearings go where. So we have our tail blade grips that have the radial bearing already in them. Before I get there, I'm going to take these little bowl links and I'm going to go ahead and screw them on to the tail blade grips. That way I get that out of the way, and it's easier to do now before the tail blade grips are inserted into the tail shaft, I guess you could call it. Let me see here. One more bowl link. Now again, it's super simple. This build, even though there's quite a bit to do, it takes about an hour and a half. Obviously, I'm afraid this video might take longer simply because maybe after it's been edited and it's been shortened, not really, but it'll take me much longer to do it during videos simply because I'm explaining things and taking it easy. It's more intimidating of a build than it really is. It really isn't that bad. So the trick here is I take a tiny little, like a 1.5, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to see which is the one with the large inner diameter. And it's really hard for the video to see this, but this one has got a lot of wiggle room there. And this one seems to go in pretty tight. So this one is the small ID, small inner diameter, small, and large. So the way we assemble this grip is it always helps if you had a way to set this somewhere. So let me see, I got a little thing with flux that hopefully will allow me to let it sit there very carefully without falling. And then the first thing we put in is this shim. It's a really thin and white shim. So I'm just gonna stick it in there and make sure it goes in. And excuse me if I'm shaking a little bit, but it's early in the morning. I had a lot of coffee and I haven't had any food. So we put that shim in there, and then we're going to do the thrust bearing. So again, I said the small one was to my left here. So, okay, that's the small ID. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put a tiny little bit of grease on these things. And again, I hate doing this because it's so messy. It's almost like I need to put grease on my hand, just like that. And then like go like this. It's almost impossible to do a clean job. So as you can see, I stick this 1.5. I put the bearings in this 1.5, and I try to clean all the excess grease from around the bearings as I can. And then we're just going to put this on the blade grip just like that. Make sure it goes all the way in. Be very careful for it to not to fall out. And basically that's it. The last step is the bolt with the little washer right there. So I'm going to have this bolt prepared. And now this is the tricky part. So we're going to put this onto here. And we have to be very, very careful that the bearings don't come out. So I'm going to hold them like that. Oh, it's beautiful. I don't know if the camera can capture it, but it's perfect. So now again, very carefully set this to the side. Make sure I have Loctite on this bolt. Clean the excess. And then very carefully, without losing anything or dropping anything, put that in there. Now, I'm done with this side. Yay. So I'm going to do the other side here and fast forward motion. Okay, now that I have this done, this is tricky because now you're pushing up against it, against the other grip, and things can shift around, but I think the bolt went in. So now I take another 1.5, which the manual fails to say that you need two 1.5s, but if you don't have two 1.5s in the form of a hex like this, then I'm sure you guys might have something like this perhaps, and just keep a spare kit so you can have an additional tool if you needed it. Okay, so that's done. So the next step is we're going to build this pitch slider assembly, which is already assembled, but this is really small parts. So the key here is we take, again, a little bit of Loctite, and see SAB here, SAB here shows green Loctite. I'm using blue on this. I've never used green and I've never had a problem. So you got to put, this is tricky. You have got to put, this has got to face there's a letter, and that letter S on the little plastic right here. And that letter S has to be facing a certain direction. So the one that's at the top has to have, as you look at this, the one that's at the top has to have the S this way, and the one at the bottom, the S facing that way. So the S is right there, and then we have this little black insert, and again, these are such small parts. We're going to go ahead and do it like this, and hopefully it'll stay in place while I insert the screw. Please stay. Oh, missed it. This is like the worst part of the whole build, just because the parts are so small. And I remember back when I used to fly line helicopters, building the T-Rex 250 when it first came out was just as painful. Because, and I'm sure the Oxyus and all the little machines like that have such small parts are just a challenge to use. I can't even imagine people that have like really big hands, how challenging it might be to do this kind of stuff. But I think finally it went in. So when you tighten these, make sure that you can tighten these pretty good, but make sure that the linkage here moves freely. This, you don't want any binding on that. That has to move really freely. So, all right, that one's good. So the one that goes at the bottom is going to have the S in the opposite direction. Challenging to work with little parts, always challenging. But as we go through the build, the parts start to get larger and larger and larger. This is technically the smallest part that you'll deal with, period, in the entire build. So, alright, so if we have the S facing this way, this S faces the other way. And I should have had that bolt ready, but I didn't. I should have had it Loctited and ready to go. And we'll do this side. Again, same deal. Just tighten it really tight. Make sure you don't over tighten. Make sure they move freely, and they both do, and they're perfect. So next up is we're just gonna slide this through the shaft. And in the manual it says here, like, it says that it is normal for the tail to feel tight after initial assembly, and it says that after some flights it's going to loosen up, and I feel the slider really tight, but the more I move it back and forth, the more it starts to loosen up, and now it's getting almost to the point where it's nice. So you have got to be careful. If it's too tight, you might want to use a little bit of sandpaper and sand the inside of that tail hub, but you be very careful not to damage it because it's such a small part, and it has a brass insert that is very easy to bend. If you bend that brass insert, you're going to be in trouble because you're not going to be able to, it's not going to slide back and forth. Alright, so the S goes opposite to the ball. We insert them in the ball there, and then we're done. So let's move on to tail sight plate assembly. Okay, so we're going to do the tail slide plate assembly right here. Basically, I got everything from bag number 3 already laid out in here. This entire bag will cover this page. So, as you can see here, you got this plate, and you got this little, I guess you could call it, I don't know, an arm or a, whatever that is. They call it a bell crank support. Stick it in like that. So you're going to end up with something that looks like that. It's a little bit confusing here if you don't follow the fact that this has to go in into this plate, like through the plate itself. So once you get that in there, we're going to use the, I think these are 6x5, tiny little screws right there. We'll use a 1.5 driver for these. And some Loctite as always. And we're going to bolt. We're going to put these bolts through here. Okay, next up is we take the bell crank lever assembly. And what I will do here is I will take the assembly like that. And I'm going to put the lower bearing like this. Just push it in. See, for this, it seems to make sense to use the needle nose pliers because the bearing, there it goes, didn't want to get in. So what I do here, and this is just me, I prefer to do it this way. I put the bearing at the bottom of it, and then what I'll do is I'll take the bolt that is supposed to go there. It's a 2x12, that bolt right there. I'm going to stick the bolt through there, and the reason why I like to do that is because that'll help me guide this tiny little insert that has to go in there like that, and then it'll help me guide this tiny little washer. And I lost my washer and I lost my insert, so let's start over. Insert. And the tiny parts. Once we get done with the tail, things will get easier. Then I'll take the other bearing and I'll put it at the top, and I'll use the bowling pliers again. And again, you don't have to do it my way, but the reason why I do it this way is because it's easier to guide that bolt through that little insert in that washer. If you do it this way, if you put the insert in the washer and then you try to stick the bolt, you're going to have a hard time, no doubt about it. Now, the difficulty is getting the bearings to go. There we go. Bearings are in, so we're good to go here. So the next thing is, now I got to be careful for that bolt not to come off of here, because again, it'll be hard to put back in. Then we're going to take these tiny little, I guess they're called the pins. And I think they still use a 1.5. Yep, they do. And since this is plastic, we're not going to use any Loctite. So the pins go like that. One pin down there. and the other pin there. Then we'll put the ball link, or the ball, this ball. And SAB tells you to use CA. I don't use CA, but I do recommend that you do. If you're very careful when you insert this ball and you don't over tighten it, it's never going to come off. If you over tighten it and you strip the plastic, yes, you have a chance of it coming off. If I can't loosen it up by hand, this tiny little helicopter will not be able to loosen it up in flight. Okay, so that's done. So we got this done. We got that done. Then we move on to the actual, like, the other side of the tail, which is the fin. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take this thing. We're going to go back to the part that we already completed, which is our tail shaft with the grips and everything. And we're going to stick it through there. And then we're going to take the pulley. And watch the orientation of the pulley. The pulley goes in that fashion, in that direction. And then there's going to be a little hole in there for a set screw. That has to line up with that dimple in the shaft. So very carefully, you insert the pulley and you try to line it up the best you can with that dimple. And I think I got it. So I'll take the set screw, which is a 2x5. It's an M2. 2.5. It's a 2.5. It's an M2.5 by 4. And this is where I run into an issue on my first build of the Fireball. And this is the part that I don't think says in the manual, but to be honest, I don't really read absolutely everything that's in a manual. And you can't use a number 1.5 for that. You have to use the tools that SAB sends you. I believe one of these is a 1.3, and I'm not sure what the other one is. I think it's a smaller, 0.7 or something like that. So they're kind enough to give you those tools, and I quite understand very well why they can't use 1.5. It's because it's such a small set screw, and the driver goes inside the screw itself, so it has to be smaller than the diameter of the screw. Okay, so I got Loctite in there. I hope this is still lined up. It's a pretty snug fit, so it should be. And very carefully put it in there. And then normally what I do is I make sure that it goes inside that dimple on the shaft. And I barely snug it, and then I try to turn it. And it should be turning. Yep, I came off of it. So I guess I didn't snug it tight enough. Let's try this again. Oh, there we go. Now I think it's in. You can see now I have a little bit of slop, but it's not moving, so that means it's inside that dimple. So now I'm going to go ahead and tighten this thing up. Again, careful not to strip it. Oh, there we go. Nice. So now that that's done, I'll move these tools out of the way and keep them handy. Then the next step here is to install the tail fin, just like that. And then there should be 2 screws or 2 bolts left. These are, again, 1.5 millimeter, and these are M1 1.6 by 5s. Little Loctite, and these are going to bolt just like that onto that original plate that we built in the beginning of the step. Okay, we're all set. Then we'll take the bell crank here, and I believe this will use a number 2. Nope, probably uses also 1.5. Yep, 1.5. We'll put a little bit of Loctite. And see, again, SAB right here shows you to use green. I am using blue for most of this build. In fact, in the beginning of the video I mentioned red, and I don't think I got to use red ever on my previous build, and that machine is flying beautiful, so no issues there. So very careful here. This is a little tricky because naturally it wants to go in like sideways or crooked, and you don't want to cross thread this. So tighten this pretty good, but be careful. This is one of those things that if you over tighten, this will be very tight. And this feels really tight. But as you can see here, they recommend micro lube. I don't know what micro lube is, but Tri-Flow oil, you know, WD-40. I use this 3-in-1 stuff right here. Just spray a little bit of that stuff, and then it'll start loosening up, and eventually it'll be nice and loose. And then just take the belt, just basically go around like this, and that completes this step, the tail system. And so once this is done, we're just going to set this to the side and move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step is Chapter 5, the tail system. This requires bag number 4, which I already emptied into here. So we'll get rid of that bag. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our boom. And pay close attention to how the boom is laid out. The boom goes into the frame in this fashion. This pointing up, this little notch right here points up. So we're going to take our boom and belt. And this gets tricky with all goblins, with all helicopters with a tail belt, period. Trying to feed that tail belt inside the boom could be quite the challenge. Normally what I try to do is I just put a piece of tape at the end of the tail belt. I'm going to try this time without doing so and see if I can get it inside here all the way through. Might be a little challenge, but we'll try. And if I get lucky, yep, which I did, tail's there, tail belt's there. So we'll make sure we have the right orientation here. And this should go just like that. Tail belt flipped around on me, but we'll take care of that right as we connect the tail boom to the frame. We will obviously make sure we have no twists or kinks on the tail belt or anything like that, but for the time being this will do. And then once this is lined up, the slots here are lined up with the little holes, the bolt holes in the boom, we're going to take these 4 little M2x6s with 4 nuts. And again, tiny little parts. And I'm going to put them all, I'm going to insert all sorry, correction, I said nuts earlier, washers. I'm going to insert all the washers through these little bolts here. Okay? And as usual, we apply a little bit of Loctite. Use blue Loctite. And even SAB tells you to use blue on this particular step, because if you ever crash hard enough to where you break something in your tail or your tail boom, you do want these bolts to come out easy. And I'm struggling with these little parts today, like big time. Can't even like. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and install these 4 right here. Okay, and as you finish putting these bolts in here, make sure that they're not tight. You want them a little snug and then back them off. You want this to be kind of loose because you want to be able to move this back and forth to eventually adjust your belt tension on the helicopter. So I'm leaving them as quite loose. There we go. And our tail belt is in. I don't know if the camera can capture that shot. And I think we're in the right direction, right orientation, everything looks fine. So I'm going to set it to the side. And the next step is to build a tail push rod. Normally, when I do this tail push rod assembly, I do it at the very end of my build, even though SAB always recommends to do it during a certain step when you're assembling the tail. I always leave this for last. However, I'm going to do it now because I already tested these dimensions and they're perfect. So the way I build this is I have a specific trick for this. I get CA, and this is not the best CA to use because this is foam safe. I hope this thing is not all locked up. Here we go. This is foam safe. You want standard CA, but still will work. Such a small machine, it doesn't really matter. And then what I do is I just put a little bit of CA, and this will make a mess. So I'll get another little rag just to make sure I don't make a mess here. put a little bit of CA on the threads on one side, just like that, and insert them into that rod. Now, I heard a couple of pilots say that the carbon rod split. Well, they're probably trying to insert it too aggressively. Just try to like turn it and thread it in. I mean, it's a really tight, snug fit, but it should not break. I've never seen one splinter or break the carbon. So I'll wipe out the excess. I got a few minutes here to work with, not much, maybe a couple of minutes until the CA starts to set. Then I'll do the same with the other side. Little CA right there. And try to thread it in there. It's a pretty snug fit, which I like. I don't like it when the rod goes in through, when the metal rod, threaded rod, goes through the carbon rod like nothing. Like, I like it when it's snug. Now, I do have my calipers here. You don't need to use calipers. You can use a ruler or something to measure. But as you can see in the manual, it says to have 10 millimeters sticking out of each end of those rods. So I'm going to have 10 millimeters here. That's about 10 millimeters. Right about there. That's close enough. Sticking out of each end. As you can see here, that's too much. So I'm going to try to push it a little in. Still too much. So it's probably easier to turn it like that. There we go. Still a little more. Hair more. Oh, maybe right there. That's close enough to 10 millimeters. Do this side, I can tell it needs to go in quite a ways. I hope my CA has not set yet. I don't think it has. That might be too short. Yes, just a little bit out now. Now this is something that the thing that I'm about to do is a trick that I've been doing for a long time with all my helicopters. And I don't think the Fireball requires this trick, but I still do it. It just gives me peace of mind. Because if the worst failure that you can have in flight is when a tail push rod moves and changes. Say your glue breaks loose and this moves and changes its length. You rather have this completely come off the helicopter and let your tail slider be free than for this to move and change lengths, because now there's no possible way to save the helicopter because you're going to have a constant pirouette. Okay, so we got 10 millimeters here, 10 millimeters here. This is my trick. I take a little bit of sewing thread like this. See if I can find the end right there. Take sewing thread and I basically cut a decent amount like that. Then I take my CA and I put CA all around the end of this rod and making it a little bit into the threaded section. Just like that. And I turn it around and make sure it's evenly distributed and coating that section. Then I take my sewing thread and I basically wrap it around. And I do a bunch of wraps. I just go like this and do, again, a lot of wrapping here. What that does is once that CA dries and cures, it's going to make this end really, really strong. And there's no possible way that this will ever come off. The part I hate about this is you have got to get CA in your hands. There's just no other way to do it. And see, now we end up with this nice, and I don't know if the camera can capture it, but it's a very nice end right here into this tail rod. Very strong. So I'm going to do that on the other side. And we'll just basically fast forward the video. And once you're done with this step, what I do is after I'm done with this is I add even a little bit more CA, but you got to be careful not to overdo it because you don't want to drip CA everywhere. Just a little bit more just to get it to really soak into those threads. into those into that sewing thread. Correct. Let's see here. That's a little much. Gonna wipe out some of the excess here, being careful for it not to stick. And that's her tail push rod. So now I'm gonna let this sit here for a little while because I want this to cure really well before I try to put the bow links in. So typically at this point I would be moving forward and going to the next segment, but since this is a video, I'm just going to let this sit here. I'm going to pause and then we'll come back and resume. Okay, this has been sitting now for several minutes, so we're going to go ahead and try to put the bow links in, and I'm hoping that they will not break loose, and generally they never have. Like I said, this trick works really well. It doesn't look very pretty. It looks pretty bad actually, but it's very functional, and it's very it gives you that peace of mind when you're flying that your tail push rod is not gonna come apart. So based on the manual, let's skip a few pages here. Based on the manual, the total dimension to the very end should be 316 millimeters. And I think my calipers don't go that far, so I really don't have a easy way to measure unless you use a ruler. And even then, I can't measure 316 because this ruler goes to 300. But if I go from the very end here to here, and then I use my calipers, this is kind of not the ideal setup, but the ideal way to do this, but you can fine tune it later. This is 300, so 316. Oh, 316 should be right there. So I am really close. I feel like I need to tighten this a little bit more. There we go. That might be the answer there. We'll see again. That's pretty lined up with the 0 there. And on this end, from the 300 line to 16, so 316 millimeters. That's pretty close, so we're going to leave it like that. And obviously, like I discussed in the beginning of the video, I'm not doing the flybberless setup on this. So, but once you set up your flybberless controller, then you can fine-tune this to make sure your tail travel is correct. Next step is the installation of the boom. So the screws that we installed here a while back, and I made a comment, don't tighten them too much. I'm going to loosen them up even more because I want to be able to stretch these frames, the frame, to be able to insert the boom easily. So I'm not even going to worry too much about the tail belt for now, but I am going to try to make sure that there's no twists. There might be a lot of different twists in there, so I'm going to try to get it the best I can. I think that's perfectly straight, and I don't know if the video can capture that, but it's really straight. So I'm going to go ahead and insert this, and this is going to twist just like any other Goblin, but we're not going to get that far right now. We're just going to insert the belt through here, and we're going to see, in the manual it says that you're going to hear that click. You didn't hear it that pronounced on my particular model because I loosened this up. But when you loosen this up, make sure that your tail servo doesn't come off, because the tail servo, as you saw in the earlier chapter of the build, the tail servo is not bolted on. It's just it's pressure fitted. So now, for all you guys that watch my tips and tricks, where I was unboxing the Fireball and talking a little bit about it and stuff like that, I mentioned that because of tolerances, you might have a little bit of play in the boom, or a little bit of slop in the connection between the boom and the frame. Now, I'm tightening this, again, the best I can without overdoing it. It's plastic, so it's going to give, so I really don't want to put unnecessary strain on these plastic parts, but I do want it as tight as I can within reason. Because I don't want my boom to be moving around. So this one has like no slop, nothing. But if you end up with a little bit of slop, you just put a little bit of tape around the front part of the boom before you stick the boom in, and that's going to remove all the slop. Again, I haven't seen one with it. I'm just thinking about, I know that there's on occasion tolerance issues that could happen when you deal with plastic parts. So next step here is we're going to install the tail push rod, and you want the SAB logo facing the outside of the ball. So we'll do it here. There we go. And make sure it's lined up. You want to make sure your tail's moving freely by moving the push rod, and mine is. You don't want any binding there. That's it. So this section is all done. Next section is the motor. So let's get to work on the motor. It's telling us to get bag 5.1 and 5.2. So bag 5, we're gonna get 5.2 and 5.1. We're of course going to get our motor as well, and the motor is at the very bottom of this extra box. This is a pretty cool motor, very innovative design. I was really intrigued and surprised by this. This is really amazing. So first thing here is we're going to install the motor pulley, the pulley for the tail, which is right here, and we're going to use these 2x4s and 2x4s, and we need, these are button heads, what it's asking us to use here for the bolts. So we're going to use these button heads right here, and they should work with a 1.5 driver, and we're going to use a little bit of Loctite as always. And as you can see here, this will go in that direction, and we're going to line it up with the holes. Now these screws are going, these bolts are going into aluminum, so you can tighten them pretty tight, but you don't want to crush the tail pulley, so you have got to be careful not to over tighten. So again, be very careful not to over tighten these to where you're going to start distorting the plastic, because you know, again, they're going into aluminum, but you're going also through plastic, through the plastic pulley itself. So you do not want to, when I start seeing that plastic material start to get a little bit distorted, I stop. And that's good enough. Then we're going to take this part here, which is our main motor plate. It's on bag 5.2. And if you look at the orientation, the logos go to the top, and the motor wires go actually in that direction, just like that. Now I'm going to solder this probably very soon here, but I'm going to go ahead and install it on this first. Now it doesn't show you in the manual that you have to solder the bullets, but obviously you do have to solder bullets here. So that's an important tip that the manual kind of does not touch upon. So obviously a lot of people will know that from having the experience to build electric helicopters, that you have to solder bullets to your motor, and unfortunately the motor does not come with them soldered. The ESC I believe does, but we'll look at the ESC a little later here. Now I hope I have, yep, perfectly lined up. I was afraid it wasn't lined up right. So we're gonna mount the motor to the plate with these four. These are 2x5s and 2x5s. Okay. Now these I'm going to tighten pretty tight, but again, remember, these are small bolts. You don't want to break them, you don't want to strip them. On these tiny helicopters, you do not want to, as I would say, gorilla grip or tighten things and then break it, and then you'll be in serious trouble because you might break a bolt inside your motor. So that's it for our motor assembly. So the manual says up next that we're going to do the ESC installation, but before I get to that, I'm going to solder the bullets to this. Okay, we're going to go ahead and solder the bullets to the motor. I already got my my ESC out of its bag, and it did not come with a connector for the main wires. It did not. So you need to pick the connector of your choice. A lot of people ask, well, I think it comes with an EC3. No, it does not. And the reason why SAB does not put a connector is because everybody has a different choice. Some people use the Supra connector, some people use EC3, some people use Deans, some people use XT60s. But they do supply the bullets for the motor, and the ESC already comes with the bullets already soldered and installed. So we're good to go there. So I'm going to go ahead and solder this real quick. My soldering iron is already warm, and it's ready to go. So I'm going to tin each one of these little wires here real quick, and then I'm just going to solder the bullets. And as I finish soldering these, one thing that's important to mention, and I should have mentioned it before I started, is try not to get any solder anywhere in the motor. This is super critical. You can ruin your motor very easily if you do. So pay close attention as you're doing your soldering job. Now, let me put this away. Now the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the ESC bag came with the heat shrink for the bullets. So I'm going to give it here a few seconds for the bullets to cool off. Here's my third one. I'll move my soldering iron out of the way because we're done with this. And I'm going to put these on the motor bullets, the heat shrink, and I'm going to shrink them up. A super beautiful heat gun, courtesy of Mr. Cashwell at Rotorcraft. Here we go. Perfect. Now let's bring the helicopter back and let's work on this section here, which is the Chapter 8, the installation of the ESC. And this requires bag 5.3, which I have right here. The ESC itself came with zip ties. So if you pay attention to the way the ESC is mounted, let me get this cable for the wire for the servo, tail servo out of the way. If you look at the way it's supposed to be installed, it goes with the SAB logo facing up, it goes with the main power leads facing back, and the motor leads facing forward. And we're gonna go ahead and feed the control wire through that hole too. And the way it goes is you loop these wires around it. So it requires a little bit of working with it to get it positioned right, especially on a small helicopter like this. Now SAB shows to run these wires to the side of it, and it's really hard to do. So I try to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them under it like that. Let's see if I can do this while trying to keep my ugly head away from the camera. These wires for the motor need to go inside this slot and facing forward like that. And then the ESC goes like that. Now I do have a little issue here. These wires are keeping the ESC from going far down. So I'm going to make sure that I can get them correctly. And you got to be careful with, if you use a tool like I'm using, just to not puncture that wire. You don't want to ruin that wire. But I think that's good enough. So once that's done, move it a little bit forward. I think it's a little bit too far back. Just like that. And then once that's in there, then what we're going to do is we're going to use a zip tie, this big zip tie. And one zip tie is more than enough. You run it through the slot right here, onto the other slot, and we're going to tighten it here. Just that. And that should be good enough. So cutters, cut the zip tie. And now we have our ESC installed. The motor wires are right here in the front. See if the camera can capture them. The 3 motor wires with the bullets are up here. The 2 main ESC wires are out here. They're still sticking out of the frame enough to where it's easy to solder the connector later. So normally I solder the connector ahead of time, but I don't see the need because there's plenty of room in there to solder. And we want to make sure that our tail servo wire and our power control wire from the ESC are coming out of the slot. And there's this bag 5.3. There's some zip ties that we really don't need for now, but this is a pretty cool idea of Enrico, the designer. He calls this the cable block. So basically, these cables right here are going to come up and are going to go right through this little indentation here in the rear part of the frame. And then you're going to install this cable block, quote unquote, right onto here, and this is going to hold your cables out of the way. So I actually like to tuck these cables into here and do my get rid of the excess inside the frame, then run them, then install the cable block, and then leave enough slack to plug into my flight controller up there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll resume. Okay, so as you can see here, what I did is I put a zip tie right through that slot, same slot as that, but on the other side of the frame. And then I tucked my wires nice and neat in there, and I zip tied it. I'm not particularly extremely picky when it comes to wiring. Some people like to use wire loom and like protect the wires. I like my setups to be simple, efficient, and fast to reproduce. In other words, after a crash, I don't want to spend all this time in the world making sure that I have my wires in a way that take an extreme amount of time, and it doesn't really give me anything in return. Wire loom doesn't do anything. It's just cumbersome. It's more stuff to work with. As long as your wires are not getting pinched and kinked, and you have a clean wiring installation, then you should be good to go. I really like this cable block, as SAB calls it. It's really a nice feature. Keeps your wires. On my original prototype or pre-production, I didn't have that, and the wires were pushing up against the canopy, and that's one of the reasons why on one of my videos the canopy loosened up and it was about to come off. So I need to get me a set of those from my Goblin. So let's go to the next step here, which would be on page 13, and this is chapter 9, the assembly of the motor, and this requires bag 5.4, which I have here handy, 5.4. So in here we're going to basically install the motor to the onto the frame itself, and get our motor, which is already ready to go here. One thing that I forgot to mention, when you run your wires, make sure that your tail servo, let's see if the camera can get that right there. Tail servo wire is really hard to see. It's out of the way of your belt. Try to make a straight loop coming out from the tail servo into here, and then get rid of the excess. Whether you get rid of the excess here like I did by looping it and zip tying it, or whether you run it all the way up here and then you get rid of the excess here around your flight controller, or whatever you do, just make sure that tail servo wire is not on the way. Now I'm going to make sure that my tail belt is straight again, because this is critical. This is a critical part of the build, because with regards to the tail belt, because we're going to install the motor, so we're going to be installing the tail belt to the tail belt pulley that's part of the motor in the front. So I think everything is lined up right, if I'm not mistaken. It's really hard to see with the small machines, but let's see. So we're going to take the motor just like that. We're going to feed these 3 wires through this hole right here, and then we're going to get the belt in the right orientation. And the twist needs to be like that, because if you look at the motor, the shaft is going to turn clockwise as you see it from above. So it means the motor is going to turn in that direction. So you want the tail belt to turn in that direction while the tail is turning away as viewed from the top. So we're going to go like that and put the tail belt on that pulley. stick those 3 wires through that slot, and I think we got it. We'll take those 4 bolts that came in bag 5-4, and they use a number 2 driver and a little bit of blue Loctite on each one of them, and we'll put all those 4 bolts in place. Okay, 4 bolts are in. Now I'm going to go ahead and tighten them, and again, these are probably one of the fewer bolts that you can actually tighten really tight because they're bigger bolts. They're going into a pin nut that's part of the plastic frame. Again, you don't want to go too tight because then you can break something or strip something, especially because we're working with plastic. Then I'm going to connect my motor to my ESC. And this is a guessing game because if it and we'll never get to that part because, as I stated multiple times, I'm not installing a flight controller. But if we got to that point where we wanted to fly and we start doing the setup, Murphy's Law usually applies for me, which means I'm going to have to switch 2 of these 3 wires because I bet you the motor will be spinning backwards. And that usually happens to me 95% of the time. So let's see here. 3 bullets are connected. Almost. There we go. Perfect. Nice and out of the way. And the next section here in the manual is the installation of the belt tensioner. So there's 2 belt tensioners on this helicopter, and it's telling us to go and reach for bag 5-5, which is right there. Now, bag 5-5 has all these little parts and components that make up the tensioner. So we have 2 completely different assemblies, the left one and the right one. So you can see the left one uses this little bracket here, and the right one uses this bracket, but they both use, the rest of the parts are all the same. So what we do is I start with the bolt right here, which is a socket head cap. It's a 2.5 by 6, and that one also requires a number 2 wrench. So we start with that, and I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of Loctite. Not much, just a little bit. And then this goes in through a washer. Washer goes in through this. And then we have this insert. It's basically, it's called a column tail. I don't know what that means, but goes in there. Probably easier just to do it this way. And then this bolt screws onto that. And then up on the other side, we're going to take the small one because we're building the left. And then we're going to take one of these tiny little flat head caps. They're 2.5 by 5. Right there. And this uses a 1.5. Put a little bit of Loctite in there. And then we're going to insert that through this. And we're going to tighten it onto that piece of copper. And then we're going to tighten both firmly, but not, again, not over tightening anything here. Clean the excess Loctite from here. Perfect. Move on to the next one. Same deal here. I'm going to put the insert first this time. I'm going to take this socket head bolt, insert the washer through it. And I apologize if while I'm describing these things I confuse nuts and bolts and washers. It's a lot of different terms to keep up with. So we go in this way. And then we take, again, one of these little guys right here with the 1.5. A little bit more Loctite. And this one goes in like that. And like that. And then once again we tighten it. Perfect. Then we install them on the helicopter. So we take these two that we have left, and again, the left one is the one with the smaller bracket up top. The right one, the smaller bracket, left one, and the right one is the bigger bracket. So left, as you can see here, these are going to go like that towards the frame. So I'm going to put a little Loctite in here. And it goes just like that. And then the right one is the exact same thing. It's just a little bit different shape because of the way the helicopter was designed. And it'll make sense once it goes in place. You will see why. Let's see here. And it goes like that. Just like that. Now, that completes this section. However, SAB does not talk about tightening the belt at this step, and I honestly don't know why, but I like to do that. So at this point, what I do is I just tighten the belt. So remember when we talked about leaving these screws right here loose in the boom? Now we're going to start tightening. So I start to pull back on this, and I start tightening. And this is, I always run my tail belt as tight as I possibly can. Always. I've always have. I know Kyle Stacy does. I know most of the guys do. If you're not going to fly any kind of hard 3D, you're just going to take it easy and you're just putting around, as I call it, then don't worry about it. But otherwise, go ahead and tighten the tail belt tension to a reasonable amount. You don't want it extremely tight to where it feels like the belt's going to break, but you want it tight enough to where you have good tail performance. The other thing that's important during this step is you want to make sure that this tail belt is riding as close to the center of the pulley as you possibly can. You don't want the belt to be riding on either side because you don't want premature tail pulley failure. I doubt the tail pulley will fail because of it, but you never know. It is always possible. So for the purposes of the video, I'm not going to spend too much time trying to line this up and make it perfect, so we can continue to move forward. But again, this is important. You want this to be riding as close to center as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, make sure my belt tension is right, and then we'll move on. Okay, the next step here is to install the servos. Now, going back to the boom real quick, as you can see, belt is right in the middle of the pulley, and belt tension is really, really tight. It's not super tight, but it is very tight. So, okay. Next up, again, servos. Bag number 6. So we'll get bag number 6. Now, what I did already earlier, in between breaks and waiting for glue to dry and things like that, is I prepare the servos. So I took the servos out of the bag. I plugged them into my servo tester, and I center them. Obviously, these servos are centering at 1500 or 1520. That's close enough pulse. So now what happens is I can, because they're centered, I could put the servo horns in the correct locations based on what the manual shows me to do. And then now I can get my helicopter all built and ready before I even plug them into a flight controller and do all my trimming. If you don't do that, then you're going to have a hard time installing the servo horns once everything's installed in the helicopter. If you put the servos in the helicopter, you will have a hard time putting the servo horns. So try to center your servos first, whether it is servo tester once again or your flight controller itself or whatever it is. You do need to center the servos. So now it's telling me bag 6, and I already opened bag 6. Came with this piece, which is one of the servo mounts. It came with 6.2, which I think is actually mount. This was inside 6.2. This is actually to screw the servos onto this. And then it came with these other bags right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look to see where the balls are. It's asking me to install the bolts right there. So I'm going to install the balls on the servos first. And once again, it says to do it on the second hole and from the outside in. So I'm going to do this real quick for all 3 servos. One thing that's important to mention here is these servos rotate. These are kind of like the BK servos. They rotate 180 degrees. So once you center them and you put your horn, make sure you don't turn them around, because you might not know which one goes where. So I know these 2, based on the manual, these 2 go in the front like that, and then this goes in the back. So let's start with the front. If you look at this graphic here, this part goes like this, and the servos, there we go. Servos go like that. Servo spline facing the down direction. Servos bolt to this part from the back, from behind. And that's what we use this bag 6.2. So we should have enough little screws here to put on every single one of these servo mounting tabs. Now, some people just prefer to just use 2 screws, 1 for each side. See, you can mount the screw in the middle and just put 1 there and 1 there, or you can put all 4. So I'm going to do all 4 per servo, just simply because there's more screws, so there's a better mounting strength, I guess you could say, for the servo itself. Okay, these are done. And then the rear one goes in here, the elevator servo. And as you can see here, I believe, I might be wrong here, but I believe it goes like that, with the servo going in that direction. So like that. So that does it for that. And then the next step is to mount it on the helicopter. And this is the only bag left out of bag 4. As you can see here, this one mounts with 3 bolts, and the rear one with 2. So there should be 5 bolts here. And they're different lengths. And if you pay attention, 2x8 in the front and 2x6 in the back. So we should have a 2x8 here in the middle in the front, 2x8. And then side of the front, the other side of the front. So 2x8s all 3, and 2x6s for the rear. Now this is going on, this is being mounted onto aluminum. So here you do have to use Loctite. And now the rear, it goes just like that. Now I did make a small mistake here. I forgot to route the wires, but it doesn't matter because they still go. But it's important that these wires face back, just like that. And then the rear servo mounts just like that onto these 2 little holes right there. So we'll get this one installed too. And that completes that. Now our servos are installed and ready. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next chapter of the build. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next step, which is the head system. And this is bag 7, which is right here. So let's go ahead and open this bag. Okay, so thrust bearings, just like we did with the tail. I'm going to leave this and these thrust bearings in their bags. It just makes things easier. They have a lot of oil in them. So I'm going to leave them here to the side. I'm going to make sure everything else gets put into this little tray so I don't lose it. And here we go. Now, one thing that I do with all my Goblin builds is I clean the spindle shaft and the tail output shaft with alcohol. And the reason I do this is because there's a lot of oil on this thing. And oil will keep your Loctite from adhering correctly, and you'll have an issue if this comes off because you're going to lose your main blade grips. I did not do that with the tail on this particular helicopter because it felt like the tail was not oily, the tail shaft, so it wasn't a big deal. But with the main, the tail spindle, I guess I'm talking about spindles here. But with the main shaft spindle, I feel like there's a lot of oil in there, and I'm just using some regular rubbing alcohol here. And I'm basically going to try to just remove some of the oil, maybe even pour a little bit of alcohol through the hole. It's not a hollow shaft, it's a solid shaft, which is really cool and unique for a helicopter of this size. So now that that's clean, I'm going to go ahead and set it to the side. So it says here to assemble the blade grip arms, which are right here on bag 7.1. Well, bag 7.1. So as you can see here, we have these little parts right here. We're going to insert the ball link in these parts, and then it gives you a dimension right here, and it says approximately 25 millimeters. So we're going to go back to the calipers to measure 25 millimeters. And when I did it with my previous build, it was pretty much spot on. Very little change. I think I had to change it a couple of turns to get it right. That's 25.32. Let's go another turn, and that's 25.06. That's perfect. Go ahead and do the next one right here. $24.99. That's perfect. Okay, so these are built. Set them to the side, right there. Then the next step is to insert them onto these things, and this is the orientation. So you take the bearing here, you take another bearing, you put it right here. It's a little bit of a tight fit of the bearings into the plastic, so I'm going to help them a little bit with the needle nose pliers. That's it. And I'm going to do the other one since I'm doing this already. Do that. Put the other bearing in here. This seems to go in easier than the other one. Perfect. And then we have, let's see, 2 long screws, 2 short screws. It says here this is a 2x8 millimeter screw. And a 2x5 is the one that holds the whole assembly together. So let's see here, that's what goes into the grip. So we're going to do the 2x8 first, and this one will go in this direction, and this is one of those where SAB recommends green, or I'm going to use blue. I'm a big fan of blue Loctite. I have never had bolts come loose, especially if they're clean and it's a new build. Maybe after you've crashed this thing a couple times and you've sort of put things together a few times, then maybe with oil and just whatever it is, the grime or whatever, you might want to use green after a while, but I tend to use blue and I've never had an issue. So put that one in there, tighten it up, make sure it's moving freely, and it is really free. And then the same thing with this one. And through here, oh, bearing came off. A little bit of Loctite. You got to be careful when you use Loctite on parts like these, because what happens is you can end up with Loctite getting into your bearings, and you really have got to be careful with that. You don't want any Loctite in your bearings, or you'll ruin your bearings. At the very least, they'll get pretty notchy. Okay, so these two are ready. So then it says to insert them or bolt them onto the main blade grips. Here's our main grips. Pretty nice CNC aluminum. And this, I was talking about this during I believe the introduction video I did to the Fireball. I also talked about it during the video I did of the unboxing, where I said that these are plastic, so they're sacrificial, but the blade grips are aluminum, so your blade grips will last forever. Literally, I don't foresee the need to ever have to buy a new blade grip unless you lose one. I don't see how you could, but other than that, I don't see how you could ever break one. So we're gonna tighten this up right here. And even though you're screwing onto aluminum, you're going through plastic. So once again, you've got to be careful not to overdo it, or you will strip it. And this one goes like this. And it's a very nice fitment there. You can feel how the blade grip arm fits onto the blade grip, and it doesn't even move, even though I haven't even put a bolt in it yet. So I really do like the fact that SAB went the extra mile with the high quality and the tolerances on this helicopter. So it's very hard to do with small parts like these. It's really hard to do. Okay, these two are done. Then the next step is to assemble this. For all of you guys familiar with the Goblin 700 and the 630 and all the bigger Goblins, this is pretty much a tail output shaft. This is not exactly it, but it's the same concept. It's really cool. You don't have multiple different parts for your hub and your main shaft. It's all like all one piece. So it's really cool. A lot less parts, a lot less work. So what we do is we insert the spindle. We push these grommets, which are basically your dampeners. It's really hard to get them in there. They're a really tight fit. There we go. It's probably easier just to do the dampeners first and the spindle later. Although I'm having a hard time because they're a really tight fit. So eventually what will happen is it'll all compress when we put it all together. So I'm not going to really worry about it a whole lot for the time being. Okay. Next thing is I'm going to take one of the blade grips and assemble the blade grip. Now, like we did before, I'm going to go back to my nice little container here. Kind of hold it all together there. And we're going to do the exact same thing we did before when we did the tail. The only difference is this is a little easier because it's much bigger parts. And you don't have to struggle with your hands to try to grab little stupid, tiny, excuse my English, but tiny little washers and things like that. So we're going to go ahead and do the big yet thin spacer first, or washer, whatever it's called. It's a spacer technically. And then we're going to go ahead and look at our thrust bearings here. And this is very much full of oil, so... And we do need to add grease. I know people that don't add grease. I've gotten away with not adding grease before, especially on such a small machine, and it's never been an issue. But the proper way is to grease them up. So I'm going to check once again. This is the small diameter. I can tell because there's no wiggle room. And this is the large inside diameter. I'm going to do the exact same thing I did before with the tail. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on my hand, on my finger here. And I'm going to grease this up. And I'm going to take this one, grease it too. And then once I have these three together, I take a tool. And then I take my trusty rag and I remove all the excess grease. And once I'm done doing that, I'm going to dump them inside the blade grip. And being very careful that they don't move away. Now this time around I'm going to do both at the same time. In other words, I did one at a time with the tail. I'm going to do them both here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the next ones. There we go. And then I'm going to make sure this thing goes inside the blade grip. Then I'm going to take these and check for small ID and large ID. That feels like small ID. That's definitely large ID. Okay, so now I'm going to stick this one in. Now, I almost screwed up. There's a washer right there that needs to go first. So washer there. And washer there. One on each side. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take these bolts, and these should be, actually I think these are 2.5 millimeter. 2.5. So I'm going to take two 2.5s. And remember earlier I talked about if you don't have two 2.5s, I'm sure you guys have excuse me, something like this laying around that you can use as well, but you're going to need two. So I'm going to take these two and I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite in here. Right now, just get it done. Loctite, Loctite. Then I'm going to go ahead and put it all together. So this blade grip goes like this. You got to be careful for that. I'm going to hold it like this because I don't want my thrust bearings to come out. There. And start screwing that in. There it is. Thanks to Uncle George Van Gansen for the tool. And then the next one here. Same situation. I want to use something so that when I push in, my thrust bearings don't come out. And I hold it like this. And the next one. And I think we got this done. Just tighten it. This I like to tighten really tight, because I don't want these things to come off in flight for sure. And they feel nice and smooth, so we're good to go with that. Let me move this out of the way. Nice, we got our head assembled. Now next up is the bearing support assembly. It says right here this should be on bag number 8. Let's see where bag number 8 is. Bag number 8. So here we have these parts right here. We have swash plate, and we have our main. This is our main bearing support for the main shaft and everything. Really nice part. Lots of work to manufacture that part, really. This is already assembled from the factory, as it explains here, so nothing to do there. We're going to work on the swash plate. So we got our swash plate. Got all the little swash plate balls. Very simple. Manual explains it very easily here. Nothing to it. Can't be any easier than that. One ball goes there, and then one goes there. One goes there, and one goes there, and then you got your two for the head right there. So I'm going to go ahead and assemble this right now real quick while we go into fast forward motion. One thing to consider, it's very hard to see, but this particular ball is the long ball. It has this tiny little groove in there that's suitable for a flat screwdriver. So I use a tiny little flat screwdriver to get that in there. And let's see here, put a little bit of Loctite onto the threaded side, and then the long one goes like that. So you might need to get it started with your fingers first, because it's really hard to get it started with a flat screwdriver. But once you get it started and you get it to where it bottoms out, then you take that screwdriver, and very carefully, because you have a very small groove right at the tip of this, very carefully you tighten it, and that should be good. So now I'm just going to go ahead and install the rest of the balls, and they all work off of a 1.5 millimeter wrench, and I like to put plenty of Loctite. I use blue, but I do like to use plenty of Loctite simply because you don't want these to ever back off in flight, back out. If they do, you're in big trouble. So nothing you can do to save the machine. Alright, let's go ahead and get these installed on the swash plate. Okay, so our swash plate is ready. And so now we're going to go ahead and put all this together. So basically the swash plate goes into the main shaft like this. These right here connect to the inner swash, as I call it, the upper part of the swash. Just like that. Like I was talking about in the beginning of the video, no need for bowling pliers, really. I mean, these things are so small, you don't even have room to stick a bowling plier in there. Then we're going to open this bag 8.3 and see what's in here. We got set screw. I'm going to set it to the side. These two plastic pieces right here. And then I have a bunch of shims. We're going to need those later, so I'm going to leave them here to the side. Here we go. And then as you can see here, what you do with this is this actually goes in this direction, just like that. And then this part goes in like this. And it goes with the set screw. And there's a, if you pay close attention, there's a dimple here on the shaft at the very tip of the shaft, and there's a groove here. So what you want to do is you want to line that up with the groove like this. And then you want to insert this to where the set screw hole lines up with that dimple in the shaft, and insert it like that. This is tricky because a lot of things to line up here. So I'm going to take the set screw, and I'm going to use my 1.5. I'm going to put some Loctite, and then hopefully everything is lined up, but I'm not totally sure, so I'm going to double check. And the way I double check is I start. Now I completely lost the alignment. I should have my set screw ready first. Let's see here. There we go. That's my alignment. I'm going to try to get the set screw in there, and I'm going to see if it's going into the dimple. And it's easy to tell because you can see how far in the set screw is going. And if you barely snug it a little bit, you can move this, and this should be able to move, but not all the way. It should have a little play. That means I'm inside that dimple, so I'm good to go. Now I can crank it. Again, not too much. Done. I did miss one step here, which was the shims, and it explains here why they sent you these shims. These shims go in between this and that, and I didn't do it because I wanted to see. I'm lying, I didn't do it because I forgot. But anyway, I wanted to see how much slop is there. You see all that slop? You got to get rid of that slop. So how do you get rid of the slop? You get rid of the slop with the shims. So I'm going to start, it says right here to start with 3. I mean, we can try 3 right off the bat. I think on my my other fireball I ended up using 2. But let's go ahead and do 3 because things change from pre-production to full production. So let's follow the manual here and do 3. Okay. And then again, line everything up. This is going to be easier because I have the set screw, the grub screw already in my driver. There. And technically I should add a little bit of more Loctite, but I added so much the first time around that I think I'll be okay. Let me double check to make sure it's in that dimple. Let's see if it should be moving ever so slightly, but it shouldn't move too much. Yep, I'm in it. Loosen it up a little more and double check. Yep, I'm right inside that dimple. I'm gonna tighten a little more. I'm gonna feel the slop. I still have slop on this one, so I might need to add the last shim. It's interesting how tolerances on tiny little parts can change, because on my pre-production, as I stated earlier, I only have 2 shims and it was slop free. So let's go ahead and add that last shim. Remove the set screw here. Leave it on my tool. And one more shim. There we go. Now I'm going to add more Loctite because I already removed this set screw like twice. That's a little too much. There we go. Try this again. Make sure it's lined up correctly. And let's hope that we don't have any slop this time around. I do want to check one more time to make sure I'm in the dimple there. And I am. Go ahead and tighten it now. And I have practically no slop. So I did have to use all 4 shims. Now that I know I'm good to go, I'm going to go ahead and give it a tiny little more of a snug there. Good. Perfect. So, as you can see here, this piece goes right there, just like that. And that concludes Bag number 8, chapter 13, assembly of the main module. Now we go to the next section here, chapter 13. So we're still basically on chapter 13, but now we're assembling the main module onto the frame, onto the mechanics. So here's our helicopter, and as you can see, the main shaft goes right into that little, I don't even know how to call that. It connects into that thing right there, whatever that is. Now, these two wires need to go inside these tiny little slots right here. So make sure that they're nice and neat on the slot, because the wire's going to run right in this section. So when you put this on, you have to be careful to make sure you're not pinching a wire. This is very important. You look at the orientation of this slot and that pin, and you try to make them mesh right about there. And then you make sure, again, your wires are not getting pinched. You have plenty of room, but yet it's easy to pinch them if you're not paying attention. And, excuse me, and once you've done that, what we're going to do is we're going to go look for bag number 9, which it says right here, and bag number 9 should have the 2 bolts that we need right here, which are 3x10s, and I'm assuming these will be a 2.5 driver, and it is. So we're going to use a liberate amount of Loctite on these. These are holding your entire main shaft to your helicopter. And we're going to go and bolt them on. Now you'll feel how this makes a connection with your frame, and it should be a nice and snug connection there. Perfect. And then the next one right here. On this side. And right before I tighten them all the way, I'm going to again check my wires are loose, they're not getting pinched. Perfect. So now I can go ahead and really tighten these. Again, I'm not going to tighten them like 700 style, but I'm going to tighten them pretty tight. There we go. And that does that. And then the next step is to install your servo linkages, which are already pre-made. No need to mess with lengths and things like that. In this particular case, it doesn't matter which direction. They can go in any direction. Your anti-rotation pin from the swash plate drops right into this piece of plastic right here. So that's a really cool feature. So let's go ahead and put these on. Put that one there, and then on the elevator servo. And then that one back here in the swash, and in the pitch servo, I think this is, or aileron servo, it doesn't matter. Left servo. That would be servo number 2 on a V-bar, or servo number 2 on a Spartan. And this one here, correction, servo number 2. And this would be servo number 3 on most flight controllers. Nice. So now we got our swash plate installed, we got our main head installed. And as we go and continue on with the manual, we've gotten to this point. And from this point on, it gives you some pointers about the length that you should have, you know, on your linkages and things like that. That's something that you obviously are going to have to double check. And as you install your flight controller and you start going through the setup, those are things that you're going to have to fine tune at the last minute. But then after that, it really starts talking about the flight control location. Again, we're not doing flight control for this video, but you know, you can install your flight controller right there. If you use, for example, say a V-bar or a Spartan or a B-Stax or, I mean, an Icon or any of those flight controllers, and you put it right there, say you use Spectrum, you can put your Spectrum satellite right there. Or you can put it right there. I would prefer it right there. I flew my mine with Spectrum for a few flights, and I had a Spectrum satellite right there. And then with the Jetty radio, I had the Jetty receiver right there as well. Obviously, with a V-Bar Neo, you just put it right there and you forget about it. You just use one unit. But this kind of goes over that, the location for things and where to install them and things like that. And then you get to this other part right there where basically it starts talking about like the battery, and you know, it shows you the slot to where you put the strap, because the kit did come with a strap. It's on a bag 11, and it comes with sticky Velcro. It comes with a Velcro strap for your battery. So it kind of talks about that, how to install your battery, how to look for your CG and stuff like that. And then it gets to the canopy, and basically it asks you to insert or to screw on these bolts onto the canopy for the magnetic latch to the canopy. And it says to refer to bag 11 and bag 12. And bag 11 is the bag I just showed you. We know it's not there, so let me look for bag 12. And bag 12 should have the canopy, and it's right there. The canopy screws or canopy latching mechanism, or whatever you want to call it. And this is super simple. You just simply take a, I think this is a 2mm driver. You take a 2mm driver, and you put a little bit of Loctite, and you're going to put these screws from the outside with these magnets on the inside, and the magnets go in this orientation, just like that. Now be careful not to over tighten these, because what's going to happen is you're going to crack the plastic. You know, this is a really strong plastic, but nonetheless it is plastic. So you have got to be careful how much you tighten these things, because you definitely don't want to crack the plastic. So we'll do one more here. And I'm tightening by hand. I'm not holding the magnet with pliers or anything, because again, I don't want to over tighten this. How about there? That's more than enough. And that's it. And then it shows you your sticker locations. I mean, that's completely up to your personal preference. Some people like to do it exactly as it's supposed to be, as per the manual and as per the pictures that you guys have seen online. Mine is pretty similar, but I skipped a couple of stickers. I'll go ahead and put these stickers on here in a little bit. But before I get to the stickers, and before I get to finishing my canopy and tightening things together, there's two things we need to do at this point. Obviously, I'm not doing flight controller, but one thing that's important is we need to do the electrostatic kit, the static kit. And as I explained earlier, that comes in a separate pamphlet here, a little instruction manual here, a tiny little thing with some cool graphics. And it's in bag number 16. The entire kit is here. So let's go ahead and go over how to install the electrostatic kit. Okay, so here's the anti-static fireball kit, part number H0902-S. This is a new one to me, because as I explained earlier, my pre-production kit did not come with it. But I feel like it's extremely important that you install this on your helicopter, on your fireball. Especially if you're going to go with this location for your flight controller, and especially if you're going to use a V-bar Neo, because the V-bar Neo seems to be really susceptible to ESD. So let's go ahead and do this together. Pretty self-explanatory. You have an anti-static column, which is this part right here, and you have to take this bearing, just a regular radial bearing, and insert it into that part right there. And then it says there to use a M1.6 by 4mm screw, and this kit came with 3 screws, and I can see that one, let's see here, it seems like 2 are longer than the other, so really hard to tell when you're dealing with such small dimensions, but for sure this one seems the shorter one. So I'm going to go ahead and put a tiny little bit of Loctite on that one, just very little, it doesn't need hardly anything. And I'm going to go ahead and screw it on. And it says to use a shim, and I almost forgot. So let me get a shim here. It comes with all kinds of different shims, and I think it comes with more stuff than you actually need to install this. But we'll go ahead and install it here. And I feel like I have no grip, so I'm going to use very carefully the needle nose pliers just to hold it while I try to just tighten it a little bit here. Not easy to deal with these tiny little parts. Alright, perfect. And then what you do is you take your boom and you place this just like that on your boom. There are two holes right there, and this goes just like that, and it rides on top of the belt just like it shows in the manual. Now it shows there to use 1.6 by 5s, which are these two that I have left here, and then it shows that one of these, I don't even know how to call these things. It shows to basically screw this onto the tail fin, and then the front one is going to hold our wire just like that. But before we do that, we need to solder that wire, at least the end, one of the ends of the wire, to this part right here. So we're going to insert the wire into that tiny little end, and we're going to solder it. And I already spliced one end right there. It's very hard to see on camera, especially with the focus, but I don't know if you guys can see it. I'm going to insert this right into here, and I'm going to just loop it a little bit, like just go like around that, and just so that it stays. And then I'll take my helping hands and I'll put it right there, and then I'll put a little bit of solder, very little bit of solder, on that connection there so that that wire does not go anywhere. And I can barely see because I'm getting old, my eyes are getting old too, but I think that's like plenty. It doesn't really take hardly anything at all to get that thing on there. Done. Perfect. So now that we have that soldered in there, I think that we can go forward, move to the next step, which is again installing this part on the boom. So I have my two screws right here, and I'm going to lock tight one of the screws first, just like that. And I'm going to install this first, if I can see. I don't know if the camera can capture that because it's probably blurry, but this is again one of those tiny little parts that are really difficult to work with, especially like holding this. I apologize if I complain too much about the same topic, but I love little machines, but I hate dealing with tiny parts because they're so hard to work with. Let's see if I get lucky and it goes in there. Yep, seems like it did. Okay, and then the next one is going to be the one that's going to hold the wire, which is this one. And it's going to go like that. And again, we're going to use a little bit of Loctite. It doesn't need much this time, like very, very little. Very little. And then we're going to put it right there. And these two screws are going to hold the wire, and they're going to hold the pulley. And what it is making a connection with the tail belt. And then it's basically taking that that connection and transferring it all the way to the front where the motor is, to the main plate. Perfect. So now that we have this in place, all we have to do at this point is just route this wire. As you can see here in the manual, we have to route this wire forward alongside the boom, and then come up and then install it on the plate, the motor plate, right about there. Now, in the manual it says that you're supposed to, it says that before tightening the screw here, it says to scratch the anodized black surface near the M2 hole. So there's an M2 hole right there, and the kit didn't come with a screw for an M2 hole, but Goblin SAB always gives you a spare bag, spare bag with different little parts. And I did find a screw that works perfect for that M2 hole. So I'm going to take that screw and I'm going to take another one of these little pieces and I'm going to solder the other end of the wire to it. But before I do, I need to make sure my wire length is correct. So if the wire is going to go under the boom with tape and then it's going to come up this way, I just want to make sure that I have the right length before I cut this wire because I don't want to ruin it. So it's going to go under the boom, probably a little bit off to the side, kind of like that, and then it's going to go up into here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the wire right about there. Done. And then I'm going to splice just a little bit of the end of it, just like that. Just like I did on the previous one, and then again I'm going to run it through here and I'm going to loop it just enough so that it stays in place. And once again I'll put it on my helping hands here and I'm going to apply a little bit of solder. And that's really all it needs. There's no reason to add more. It's such a small gauge wire. Again, all we're trying to do is establish a connection between the tail belt and the motor, the main area, to avoid electrostatic. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll deal with this wire off camera and then I'll show you what I did, because I'm going to use some tape to kind of tuck it in and make it look nice and neat. But for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and install this onto the main plate. And again, it says in the manual one more time to scratch the anodize. And the thing is, SAB's anodizing is really powerful, and it prevents it makes it non-conductive. So take something, like, it doesn't matter, I'm even using one of my drivers and I'm going to scratch the anodizing. I hate to do this to a beautiful helicopter, but this is very important so that you have the continuity that you need. So this basically grounds the tail, and it makes that discharge not happen. And if it happens at such a small degree that it doesn't hurt anything. So as you can see here, you tighten this. Don't need to really crank on it because it's such a small thing. And that's it. And then what I'm going to do again off camera is I'm going to take this electrostatic wire and I'm going to do some kind of nice tucking and kind of get it out of the way and make it look nice and neat. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and I'll come back. Okay, so we have a completed helicopter. This is what I did with the electrostatic kit. I just used clear tape. In the manual it says to use goop or tape or something to hold it out of the way. But this is a plastic boom, so it's really easy to put tape. Doesn't matter, it's running under the boom. By the time you put the canopy on, you will never see anything. But as you can see, it runs all the way from the tail right here under the boom, and it goes up this way, up into the motor plate. And then as you put your flight controller here, you know, you can kind of make this nice and pretty in this section right here. So at this point, if I was going to continue on, I would go ahead and solder my connector to the speed controller. I would plug in my flight control system, my fly system, and I would start my setup. Other than that, after I was done with my setup, I would go ahead and set up the stickers. And you know, stickers are a pain in the butt. They're really hard to do. But, you know, it's the beauty of a plastic helicopter. I mean, this canopy's so cheap. If you break it, which I doubt you will break it very soon because it's really, really strong. It's deceiving on video. But if you end up breaking it, it's very inexpensive. And you just get more stickers and you have a brand new canopy. So I'm going to go ahead and do the stickers. And then I'll show the completed product. I'll put the blades. Things like that. The blades, the bag 13 is the bag that has the bolts that you need, and bolts and nuts for your main blades, carbon fiber main blades, which are really nice, and for your tail blades. So I'm gonna go ahead and install those off camera. I'm gonna put the stickers on, and when I install the stickers, I just again use some good old rubbing alcohol, clean the plastic real well with a very soft microfiber towel like I have here. I'll clean it up real well, and then I'll adhere the stickers to it, and I'll put the blades, and then I'll come back and show you the final product. Okay, and this concludes the built video for the Goblin Fireball, also known as the Goblin 280. Here it is. Pretty freaking cool machine. I got the blades in. I got the stickers. I got the stickers in the canopy, just the way they're supposed to go. Again, the only thing this thing needs now, it's a fiberless system. It needs a connector for the battery and a battery. And of course doing the setup, which, you know, if you're familiar with your own flight controller, if you've been using the same fiberless system for a while, it should take you no time to do. So as you can see, this can be done in about an hour and a half. If you're really rushing it, if you're really taking your time, it might be about 2 to 2.5 hours. So it's really not that bad. Very simple machine. Once it's built, not a whole lot going on in terms of damages during crashes and things like that. So repairs are really, really, really fast. And parts are really inexpensive. So if you haven't tried one yet, this is the time. And once again, Goblin Fireball. I hope you guys enjoyed it. So for all of you guys interested, this is my man cave. This is where I just finished the video. Pretty small area here. You can see my contraption for my overhead camera. You can see my light. So my lighting wasn't great. My to-do list, it's been modified for the day. So cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I got RC cars. I got all kinds of stuff here. Radios. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. And it's time to freaking jam. See you all later. Goodbye.